Dreaming in Darkness by R S Cartwright. 1. A total blackness surrounded Becky Sanders. No substance, no discernible features of any kind. She seemed to be floating, buoyant. Suddenly her feet touched ground. The blackness faded. Again she found herself amidst trees of a somewhat familiar wood. It was night, darker than usual. A formless shadow moved amidst the trees, lurking there, watching Becky. Then she remembered. It had followed her these many nights, toyed with her, entered her mind, planted grotesque and unholy images there. The images were of things to come, things it planned to do to her, each night a little closer, each night a little clearer. Becky fled the formless shadow. It followed, seemed to guide her steps, made her go in the direction it wanted her to go. There was something ahead in the woods, something she feared she didn't want to see. It guided her toward this unseen, unknown something. She turned, ran, hoping to reach... It was a cabin, she knew, a cabin within a creek. Though her memory was vague, images of a creekside cabin amidst a cluster of trees floated into her thoughts. Gasping for breath, she stopped and crouched in the dark against a tree. She peered about, her eyes intent on the dark woods. Something was out there. Every night, something was out there. She wondered how long she'd have to run before it caught her, how many times she'd have to run. This wasn't the first time. She shivered and pulled her tattered green woolen cloak tighter. She quietly leaned forward, turned her head slowly, and watched for a sign, some sound or movement. It was then she noticed the silence. A smothering blanket of silence had descended. All the creatures of night cowered, quieted. They'd sensed something unnatural and deadly, a predator moving among them. The thing paused and glared about its surroundings. It took momentary note of the cowering night creatures, but paid them no heed. It wanted something else. It wanted Becky. The glow of its eyes softened as it moved on. It moved silently, softly. Not a twig snapped, not a leaf rustled, not a branch broken. It was keen on the scent of Becky, and knew she was near. It paused, made a soft clicking noise, then moved on. There she was, straight ahead, crouched against a tree, glancing fitfully and fearfully into the darkened woods. The thing clicked softly as it noted her fear. She truly had everything to fear. She was on a path of discovery to things she should not know, and she had to be stopped. She would be stopped. Becky leaned back against the tree and pressed the palms of her hands against her ears. She closed her eyes tight, squinting. "Let me go home!" she screamed. A sudden movement of shadow caught her eye as she opened them. Becky glanced in the direction of the shadow. This presence, this shadow, was darker than anything she'd known before. She pulled herself into a sitting position, drew her knees up under her chin, wrapped her arms around her legs, and clasped her fingers together. Her chin rested on her knees. She peered into the dark woods, her eyes and ears alert, listening. Then the sounds came. The same sounds she'd heard many times before. There was a clicking noise, and a strange buzzing that reminded Becky of slurred electronic or mechanical speech. The sounds echoed out of the nearby dark. Becky turned her eyes to their source. The shadow shifted. Becky caught sight of movement as the thing crossed into an oblique shaft of moonlight. She gasped, caught her breath in her throat as she noted its form, silhouetted against the moonlight. It was an unearthly shape, with elongated arms ending in what appeared to be great claws. Wings were partially folded, and drawn in against the abomination. Becky found herself jumping to her feet and running headlong into the dark of the woods. She ran blindly, not sure of her course. She knew she had to get to the cabin. The cabin with the trickling water of a nearby stream. Her heart jumped into her throat as she heard the buzzing sound again. It was shrill, whirling, sounding as if the thing was excited. Behind her came the snapping of twigs. It was coming, following her, rapidly. Low-hanging branches snapped against her face as she ran. Red welts of pain and discomfort formed on her cheeks. She tried to pick up the pace, run faster, as fast as she could. Her breath quickened, her eyes teared. She gasped, sucked air as if it was the last, her death if she could not reach the cabin. The clicking and buzzing was suddenly louder. Becky's eyes went wide. It was gaining, was behind her, right behind her. Suddenly there was a light through the trees. Becky broke into a small clearing. There was a small cabin, the cabin of her thoughts. The soft yellow firelight of a fireplace was glowing through a front window. She ran headlong across the clearing to the front door. She grabbed the door handle, began to turn it, then froze as she felt a soft touch on her right shoulder. There was silence in the dark woods now. No buzzing, no clicking, no snapping of twigs or branches, no night sounds of any kind. Becky held her breath. Her eyes were wide as she slowly turned her head. A shaft of ice-cold fear tore through her as she looked upon a pink claw, like a huge crab, resting on her shoulder. The sight of the crab-like claw jarred Becky awake. She forced back the scream as she sat up on the couch. Blood raced, perspiration trickled, yet she felt uncannily cold. She drew the green wooden Pendleton blanket tighter and peered timidly about the cabin, half expecting to see the crab-like thing of her nightmare lurking in a darkened corner. But it wasn't there. "Asleep, asleep," she whispered softly. "I fell asleep." Still clutching the blanket, she sighed, pushed herself to her feet, and peered about the small cabin. It was sparsely furnished. A work-desk was cluttered with typewriter and paperwork. A single dusty bookcase stood in a corner. There were softly glowing embers of a dying fire in the fireplace, and the breakfast bar was also cluttered. Becky glanced at the alarm clock on the breakfast bar. The LED numbers were softly glowing red. It was 11:35 p.m. She'd slept for almost 2 hours. 25 minutes, and it's the witching hour, she muttered. How appropriate. Becky turned and crossed the floor to a window. It was a side window, and it was open. She stared out into the dark night of Columbiana County's Pine Hollow countryside. The moon shone ashen grey through the trees. The soft light cut across the grass between the woods and the window where Becky stood. She could barely hear the soft trickling of Pine Hollow Run just beyond the line of trees. Barely 4 inches deep, the creek meandered past the cabin. A little over a mile to the southwest, it joined with the middle fork of Beaver Creek. Except for the trickling waters of the shallow creek, it was a quiet night. Becky turned from the window. She stared at the work table cluttered with notes, various texts, the thesis, and her old Olympia typewriter. Work, she voiced softly. She sighed and shook her head as she glanced at the typewriter. A blank page was scrawled in the carriage. Not tonight. It was back to sleep for Becky. She crossed the room, crawled back onto the couch, dragged the green trapper's blanket up around her shoulders. Curled up on her side, she closed her eyes. Weary from a long day's research and a walk in the woods, it didn't take her long to fall asleep again. Outside, the darkness crept closer to the cabin. The soft, ashen light of the moon seemed to dim as if a shadow had moved across it. Becky drifted into a deep, undisturbed sleep. The carriage of her typewriter slowly began to move, on its own. The keys clicked out a message on the blank page. Then it stopped. Only the soft trickling of Pine Hollow Run disturbed the dark night that surrounded the cabin. 2. The rising sun was uncommonly warm, burning off a light covering of fog. Birds sang their morning songs. Small woodland creatures scurried in the underbrush for their early morning meal. The water of Pine Hollow Run trickled softly past the cabin while the water of Becky's coffee-maker trickled softly into her waiting coffee-pot. She stood at the breakfast bar, leaning forward, her hands splayed out on the counter in front of her. She'd awakened only moments earlier, still trying to shake the wispy strands of sleep from her mind. Coffee, she muttered, trying to find something for her sleep-jumbled thoughts to cling to. Coffee. The sun inched higher. A shaft of bright sunlight rolled in through the window. It cut an oblique angle across the breakfast bar. Becky turned her eyes to the light. There were dancing dust particles in the light. She smiled dimly, glanced at the coffee-maker, then absently shifted her gaze across the countertop until she fixed on the red Folgers can. Her mind went blank, and from the depths of her subconscious a single thought began to rise. Cylinder. She voiced the thought softly. She had no idea why she'd made the abstract association. A metal cylinder. Brain in a can. Her thoughts startled her fully awake. Her eyes went wide as she pushed away from the breakfast bar. There was something there. Some dark meaning, a remembrance of something which had brought the abstract thoughts to mind. She shook her head to dispel a momentary uncertainty. Whew! Coffee! I need coffee, she said softly to herself as she turned to a cupboard. But a trace of uneasiness lingered. She took a cup from the cupboard, then jerked the coffee-pot from under the drip pan, the still percolating coffee hissing as it trickled onto the hot plate. She poured herself a cup, then returned the coffee-pot to the hot plate. The coffee, hot and black, warmed her as she took a sip. Eyes over the rim of the cup caught her cluttered work table. The cup lowered slightly. She sighed. Well, I should get started, she muttered, still staring at her work table. It's not going to get done all by itself. With a passing glance at the Folgers can, the lingering uneasiness now rapidly fading, Becky rounded the end of the breakfast bar and crossed the room to her work table. She set the cup down next to her typewriter, then stood there, hands on hips, fighting to work up the ambition and energy to start where she'd left off on her senior thesis. There was a stack of freshly typed pages, the title page on top. Strange and Obscure Cults Across Rural America. Becky read the title silently and shook her head. A required senior thesis for all graduating undergraduate seniors had been instituted by the university the year before. Becky had been a junior. There'd been some debate with university officials as to when the new policy would take effect. Becky had hoped the debate would see her through her senior year. She hoped she'd slip through the system without having to write the thesis. But the debate ended as quickly as it had begun. The new policy would take effect with all returning seniors. And Becky had been a returning senior. Just my luck, she voiced, disgruntled. Oh well. She sighed, reached for her coffee and took another sip. Cup in hand, she slid into the chair and turned to her typewriter. Her eyes went wide as she stared at the page in the carriage. What in the... She voiced her surprise. There were words on the page. When she'd inserted the paper into the carriage the night before, it had been blank. Now there were 3 sentences, all in caps. 2 sentences were flushed left with the margin. The 3rd sentence was 2 spaces down and started at mid-page. They came for old George. They came for me. Warn Susan to stay away. What? Who the hell is Susan? Her voice was soft, puzzled. She began to have an unexplainable feeling of uncertainty and discomfort. An unconscious reaction at first. But it was growing. Goosebumps trickled to life down her arms. That same uneasiness she'd felt was returning. She sat back in the chair, her eyes still on the page. She convinced herself that she hadn't put those words on that page. It was blank, she muttered. I know it was blank. The telephone rang. Becky jumped in her chair. She caught her breath and slowly glanced at the cordless phone on the cluttered breakfast bar. Pushing herself from the chair, she crossed the room to the phone. Persistent, whoever it is, she thought as she reached for the phone on the 6th ring. "Hello," she said, and her thoughts suddenly began to spiral down a whirlpool of darkened memories. This had happened before, this phone call. She was sure of it. Her eyes went wide, her mind keying on the thought. The telephone call had already happened. Already happened. A misty lightness swirled around her. She felt as though she were floating, buoyant, lost in some darkened limbo where everything was hazy, distant, dreamlike. And somewhere in the distance a voice was calling to her, calling her back. "Sanders?" the soft female voice was saying. "Miss Rebecca Sanders? Are you there?" The voice on the phone cut through her spiralling reverie. The mists of remembrance and uncertainty clouding her thoughts and vision dissipated. She let go of the hesitance and uncertainty, glanced across the room at her typewriter, then turned her attention back to the telephone and caller. Yes, she said hurriedly. "Sorry, I was distracted a moment." And glancing at the cold and empty stove, she added, "Water on the stove boiled over." "That's quite all right. This is the Leper Public Library in Lisbon. I'm calling to inform you that the book you requested on interlibrary loan has arrived." "Thank you," Becky replied. "I'll be down for it later today." She hung up the phone and stared blankly, her hand still on the receiver. Then, shaking her head to clear her thoughts, she glanced at the typewriter. "Man, I need some fresh air," she thought aloud, and crossing the room she grabbed her coffee cup from the work table and turned toward the door. Pine Hollow Run glistened in the mid-morning sun. The mirror of light poured into Becky's eyes as she sat on a log. She sipped her coffee and stared at the gently rolling water. The warmth of the sun and the bright light in her eyes caused her mind to wander. The surroundings slowly faded. Her thoughts drifted. She focused on nothing, and then reached a central point somewhere deep inside. It was a hollow place, deep and dark, with no sound. Her thoughts continued to drift, without purpose or direction. A sense of gentle motion began to come over her, as though she were adrift in a great black sea of warm liquid. It was a floating sensation. Becky felt herself gently settling as though she were slowly sinking. And then the motion gently reversed and she felt herself rising. The motion was slow and gentle. Becky was soothed by it. She hadn't a care. She wanted to stay in this gentle and peaceful unknown place of darkness, her thoughts adrift. A soft noise from somewhere nearby released her drifting thoughts. She floated to the surface, back to the light of day once more, back to the trickling waters of Pine Hollow Run. The sound echoed in the air amidst the pines. Becky smiled. She turned her eyes to the towering trees, searching for the source of the soft and gentle voice of the songbird perched somewhere unseen. The calm serenity of the dark unknown place where Becky's mind had escaped, and the gentle, pleasant song of the songbird hidden in the pines, faded to disappointing shadows as her thoughts drifted to her unfinished thesis. She had only a week left before it was due. It was time to get back to work. She sighed and rose to her feet. Her eyes drifted from the rolling waters of Pine Hollow Run to the gently swaying pines. She paused. The sun was warm on her face. For a passing moment she closed her eyes and smiled, and then turned toward the cabin. She climbed the creek bank, pushed off a pine, and started across the small clearing between the creek and the cabin. Her eyes drifted to the cabin window that faced the creek. It was the same window where she'd stood the previous night after having awakened from her nightmare. She chuckled softly as the thought of the nightmare crossed her mind. She knew it was silly, just plain stupid. A grin crawled across her face. She shook her head as she passed the window and started around the corner of the cabin to the front door. A roving eye caused her to stop in her tracks. She dropped the coffee cup as she backtracked 2 steps. Her eyes were wide, her grin now a frown. On the ground were tracks in the soft earth. They led from the side window around the corner to the front door. The tracks were not human, not animal, at least not any animal that she knew of. The sudden thought of her nightmare, and that thing with the pinkish claw resting on her shoulder came back in stunning clarity. "May I help you?" the young librarian questioned as Becky approached the counter. Becky took her in with a casual glance. She was petite, trim, maybe mid-30s. She sported long blonde hair rolled and bobby-pinned on the back of her head. Her blue eyes sparkled behind wire-rimmed glasses. She wore a navy blue skirt with matching blazer, looking more like a corporate executive or legal eagle than a librarian. A blonde bombshell clothed in respectability. The thought casually occurred to Becky as she stepped up to the counter. Drop the pinned hair and glasses, baby. "I'm Rebecca Saunders," Becky replied as the librarian tilted her head and smiled. "I have a book waiting." "The Akeley book?" the librarian interrupted. She turned to a bookcase with a number of books haphazardly arrayed. They were wrapped in rubber bands and paper tags. Her fingers danced down a number of book spines and then paused on one. "Ah, here we are." She pulled the book from the bookcase, removed the paper tag and rubber band, and turned back to Becky. "Esoteric Cults of New England, by George Akeley," she added as she opened the book, scanned the barcode, then handed it to Becky. "Interesting reading." "Just research," Becky smiled, "for my senior thesis." "Senior thesis? Yeah, I have to research and write a paper to graduate," Becky muttered. "So I chose weird cults." "Well, there's plenty of weird stuff in that," the librarian smiled, tapping the book cover. "You're familiar with his work?" "Only through a few books my grandfather has," the librarian replied. "George Akeley was my great-grandfather," Becky said. "Never met him." "Well, I hope your research goes well," the librarian replied, then offered a hand. "I'm Susan Lewis," she said. "If you need anything here, don't hesitate to stop by or call." Susan. Becky's eyes drifted to the name on the page back at the cabin. Her eyes were wide as she hesitantly shook hands. "Ah, thanks," she finally said. She stepped away from the counter, nodded with a smile, and then turned to the door. Susan Lewis watched her go. There was something about her. Something had startled the young lady when Susan mentioned her name. She could see it in Rebecca's manner, the hesitance and surprise. Perhaps she had something on her mind. Susan tried to shrug it off, but the ill feeling remained. Becky sat in her jeep in the library parking lot, the engine running while she paged through the Akeley book. There were diagrams of strange, unearthly symbols and formulae. Strange creatures jumped out at her from the pages. Odd conglomerations of letters formed words of some unrecognizable language. Gibberish, she thought softly aloud, and paged on. Her eyes narrowed as she scanned the pages. She picked out bits and pieces of information, details that erupted upon her thoughts. Though amazed and shocked at times, she casually dismissed most of what she saw. Her thoughts danced as her eyes caught details. She turned another page and paused. Words jumped out at her. Moons, capsules, cylinders. Her thoughts ground to a halt. A sudden feeling of uneasiness came over her. She was troubled. Something about that word. Cylinders. Something profound, but she couldn't remember what. Slowly she lifted her eyes from the page and stared blankly into space. She focused on the word. "Cylinders," she muttered. "Cylinders. Why do I—" She sighed, shook the thoughts from her mind, and dropped the book on the passenger seat. Dropping the jeep into first, she pulled out of the parking lot and east onto Lincoln Way. "The sooner I get this thesis done, the better," she growled under her breath as she left Lisbon behind. Ahead lay Elkton and Pine Hollow beyond. She glanced at the book on the passenger's seat. A persistent thought came to mind. Cylinders. And a chill ran through her. 3. Becky entered the cabin. She felt uneasy. Something strange was going on. She slowly dropped her book bag onto the work table and peered fearfully about, turning a circle in the centre of the cabin. Everything appeared to be normal. The coffee maker was turned off, the nearby empty pot of coffee now long cold. Becky's notes, papers, books, articles, and thesis littered the work table. The page with the 3 sentences still rested in the typewriter carriage. Yes, everything was back to normal, but she couldn't shake the feeling of uneasiness. Something heavy was in the air, as if some unseen thing was lurking in the shadows, watching her, waiting, ready to... Listen to the words! They speak! They know! The voice was soft, ethereal, feminine, and familiar. It came out of thin air. Then another sound. Becky's eyes went wide. She slowly turned to the sound of clicking typewriter keys. The carriage was slowly moving all by itself. Becky hesitantly approached the work table and stood facing the typewriter. Her eyes scanned the letters that the typewriter was typing, adding to the words already there. ITHINADREAMEAP. She read the letters as they appeared on the page. 1827, 1927. The carriage stopped. The typewriter fell silent. Becky read the words softly. All that we see or seem is but a dream within a dream. EAP 1827. Frightened, she slowly backed away. Her thoughts were disjointed, jumbled, out of sequence. 2 words from the quote filtered through the miasma of her thoughts. A dream, she voiced softly. Turning from the work table, her eyes inadvertently came to rest on the phone. Poe, she voiced softly as she hurried to the cluttered breakfast counter. Post-it notes scattered as Becky looked for the leper librarian phone number. She found it, picked up the receiver and dialed. Susan Lewis answered on the 4th ring. Leper Public Library. Susan Lewis? Becky asked softly, her voice quick. Yes, this is Susan Lewis, Susan replied. Miss Saunders? Yeah, Becky said absently, nodding her head. I was wondering, do you have a book of poetry by Edgar Allan Poe? We should. Let me check for you. Becky waited. Her eyes drifted to the typewriter, then absently around the room. She sought out the dark corners, straining to find something, anything lurking there. There was nothing. She could hear the clicking of plastic keys through the telephone. Susan Lewis was searching for a Poe listing in the Leper Library database. There were several. Miss Saunders? Yes? We have the complete poems of Edgar Allan Poe, the librarian said, and it's not checked out. Good. I'll be in to get it, Becky said. We close here in about 15 minutes, Susan said. If you'd like, I can drop it off for you. I can't ask you, Becky began. It's no problem, Susan interrupted. It's Friday, and I'm on my way to East Palestine anyway. I can swing by. All right, Becky replied. I really appreciate it. I'm staying in a cabin about a mile outside Elkton on Pine Hollow Run Road. It's back off the road on the north side. My jeep's in the driveway. It's gravel, can't miss it. Okay, I'll be there in about an hour. Thanks. Becky paused, staring blankly, then slowly hung up the phone. She crossed the room, unconsciously hurried past her work table and stretched out on the couch. Closing her eyes, she smiled, as a peaceful, relaxing feeling began to overcome her. Her thoughts began to swim, and then spiral toward oblivion. It wasn't long before she had fallen asleep, her slumber undisturbed by sound nor nightmare. The little old man waited at the side of the road. Shoulders hunched, his skin hung strangely loose on his frame. He cackled in a buzzing voice, strangely metallic. It was followed by a clicking noise. He shuffled back a step as a car appeared from around a bend. He cackled again as the car passed by and disappeared down the road. It wouldn't be long, he knew. He had ways of knowing that others didn't know, he and his kind. They all watched and waited, had been doing so for thousands of years. Only when someone was on the verge of discovering the truth, only then were those foolish people removed. So it was with the woman in the little red sports car. First she'd be removed, then the other. The little red sports car rounded the bend just like he knew it would. He shuffled 2 steps onto the side of the road and waved both arms in the air, flagging her down. She pulled over. He cackled under his breath and made a soft clicking noise as he shuffled to the driver's side window. The window was rolled down. A young blonde woman in wire-rimmed glasses peered up at him. "My wife. Something's wrong with her," the strange old man whistled. A short pause told him she suspected nothing by the sound of his voice, despite the strange metallic buzzing, despite the sound slightly out of sync with the movement of his lips, like a film soundtrack out of sync with a film. An arm raised, the skin of his hand flapping in a slight breeze, he added, "We live in a small cabin out there, down a short path. Can you help? Please." He shuffled back a few steps. Susan turned her car off, pulled the keys from the ignition, and climbed out. She dropped the keys in her purse and glanced around. "What path? Where?" she asked. "Oh, here," the old man cackled. He shuffled towards the edge of the road, then paused as Susan glanced over her attire. "I'm not really dressed for—" She fell silent as she peered at her skirt, matching blazer and high heels. She shrugged at the old man. "Please help," the old man said. "I'm afraid something's really wrong." "All right," Susan said. With a passing glance at her car, she started toward the old man. He grinned under the loose folds of his skin as he turned and started down a narrow path into a stand of trees. Susan struggled with her heels on the narrow dirt path. She paused long enough to take them off and carry them, walking in her stockinged feet. A loud buzzing noise suddenly erupted nearby and permeated the woods. Susan's eyes shot open wide. She glanced hesitantly about while following the old man. The buzzing noise began to fade and then was gone. She voiced softly. "I wonder how big the insects get in these woods." The old man chuckled softly under his breath. The woods were growing thicker, the shadows were longer and darker. It seemed strange to Susan that it had grown oppressively silent. There were no sounds. Woodland creatures had gone quiet as they passed, and though it seemed they'd walked deep into the woods, they really hadn't gone far when they finally came to the small cabin. Small wasn't the half of it. To Susan it was tiny, more like a tool shed. It was old, weathered, with a latch on the door. There was one small latticed window with a broken pane. Strangely, a humming noise came from inside the cabin. Red, green, and amber lights were blinking through the single window. The old man shuffled to the door. He lifted the latch and opened it. The humming grew slightly louder. Susan paused. She glanced at a darkness occasionally split by the softly blinking lights, and then looked at the little old man. "She's here," the old man cackled and gestured into the shed. Susan caught her breath and started for the door. She passed the little old man and entered the shed. He quickly followed her inside, and the door swung shut. The shed was gloomy inside. A droning hum and the soft flash of the coloured lights caught Susan's attention. The cycle of flashing lights repeated itself, over and over. On a table were 2 metal cylinders, and on the floor beneath the table were 3 small metal boxes. apparently some sort of machinery with cables running from each machine to the 2 cylinders. The cylinders stood upright, about 2 feet tall, a foot in diameter. Near the bottom of each was a needle gauge. Above each of the gauges were 3 sockets spaced in the form of a small triangle. The cables from the 3 metal boxes beneath the table were plugged into each socket. Beneath the gauges were 3 small lights placed in a row: amber, green, and red. One cylinder was in operation, the source of the humming noise and blinking coloured lights. The other cylinder was dark and silent, its top open. There was a chair turned away from the table. Leather shackles were fastened to the arms and front legs. Otherwise the shed was empty. No other furniture, no tools, and no wife for the old man. A sudden fear gripped Susan. She slowly turned, expecting some explanation from the old man. The old man stood behind her, but he wasn't alone. A thing stood next to him, a thing of about Susan's own height. To the best of Susan's judgment, it looked like a giant, upright-standing crab, with pink claws that were clicking frantically. Her sight faded quickly as the room began to swim. She was out cold before she hit the floor. Only minutes had passed. Susan awoke and found herself strapped to the chair. She was naked, her clothing discarded in a corner. 2 meat hooks hung close together from the ceiling. Susan caught her breath as she saw the old man shuffle out of the darkness. Behind him she could barely make out the teetering form of the crab-like thing. It was softly buzzing and clicking. The old man approached. Susan caught a glint of metal in the soft flashing of the cylinder's coloured lights. Grasping her by the head, the old man raised the surgeon's scalpel. Susan's screams of pain and terror filled the shed and the woods beyond, but no one heard. Becky closed the Akeley book and held it balanced on her leg. She rubbed the sleep from her eyes and peered at the 4-inch deep trickling water of Pine Hollow Run. Her thoughts flowed momentarily with the water. She turned her attention back to the book, paused as she glanced at the cover, then slapped the book against her leg and jumped from the log where she'd been sitting. Gently tapping the book against the side of her leg, she started toward the cabin. It was twilight. Long past the hour Susan Lewis should have been there with the Poe book of poetry. Something was wrong. She could sense it. It didn't take that long to go from Lisbon to Pine Hollow Run Road. Becky gave a passing thought that it could be something simple. Maybe a flat tire or something like that. "No, I don't think so," she muttered as an afterthought. "It's too late for her," came a soft, ethereal voice. Becky froze, then slowly turned. The trickling water of Pine Hollow Run faded as she disregarded the sound. Her jumbled thoughts tried focusing on the image that stood before her a few short feet away. The image was of Becky herself, but different. This Becky was ethereal, ghost-like. The image's hair buffeted on an unseen wind, while Becky's own hair lay placidly about her shoulders. "How? What?" Becky stammered as she stared at the ghostly image of herself. "This can't be happening." The ghost image turned to face her, its motion slow, languid. "But it is, and was," the image spoke. The words were slow and drawn out. Becky shook her head in disbelief. It was an unconscious effort to rattle clarity and order back into her thoughts. "I can't believe I'm talking to myself," she exclaimed. "At least a ghost of." "The words tell." The image nodded haltingly as she interrupted. Her voice took on a more musical tone as she continued. "Susan knows. She was and is. Just like you." The image paused. A slow smile spread across her face. "Like me. Like us. We know." "We know what?" Becky was incredulous. "The dream. In the darkness there are dreams," the image said softly. She smiled and lifted an upturned palm as if in homage to some unseen and unknown force. "Listen to the words," the image added softly. "They speak. They know." She slowly closed her eyes. "What words?" Becky questioned desperately. "What are you talking about?" "Listen to the words. They will tell you." The image's words echoed behind Becky, yet the image hadn't spoken them. Becky stared at the image. Her eyes were still closed, hair still buffeted on an unseen wind, her hand still raised. It seemed that the ghost-like image was asleep. Becky turned, only for a moment. She glanced over her shoulder in the direction from which the words had come. Turning back, the image was gone. She dropped the borrowed Akeley book in the grass, and made a mad dash for her mountain bike that was propped against the cabin wall in the driveway. Jumping on the bike, she disappeared down Pine Hollow Run Road towards Elkton. It was dusk. Shadows were lengthening as Becky found Susan's car. She slid the bike to a stop, dropped it in the grass along the road, and hurried to the driver's side window. It was open. Becky leaned in. Poe's book of poetry lay on the passenger's seat. There was no sign of Susan, no keys in the ignition, no sign of trouble or a struggle. Becky glanced around, saw high heel marks in the soft earth. She followed them to a narrow path that led into the woods. Becky glanced back at the abandoned car. Where the hell was she going? She muttered the thought. She shook her head and continued down the path into the already shadow-shrouded dark. Fear crept into her thoughts as she walked the path into ever-increasing darkness. It was eerily quiet, no sounds of any kind. She kept trying to focus on anything to dispel the fear, but her thoughts kept returning to Susan. Where had she gone, and why? She'd pulled off the path for some reason, followed this path to some place. Lured was the thought that kept coming to mind. She was lured, Becky thought aloud, and I'm walking right into it. The path suddenly opened into a small clearing. Becky stopped. There was the shadowed form of a small shed nestled on the edge of the woods. A soft humming noise was coming from the shed, and coloured lights pulsated through a small window, red, green, and amber. Becky slowly approached and saw that the door was slightly ajar. She paused at the door, then cautiously entered. Her eyes went wide as she stifled a scream. In the softly pulsing coloured lights she saw the cylinders on the table, and the machinery on the floor. A body was seated in the chair. The body was female, skinned, the top of its head gone. So was its brain. Its teeth were slightly parted in a mocking grin, and the skin hung from the meat hooks, as if to dry. "The cylinders, Becky," came Susan's strangely metallic, disembodied voice. "The cylinders. For me and you." Becky realized Susan's voice was coming from one of the strange metal boxes beneath the table. She haltingly shook her head in fear as she backed away toward the door. The last thing she saw in a flash of amber light before she bolted from the shed and into the woods was Susan's crumpled clothing lying in a corner. 4. Becky ran headlong into the woods, a strange clicking and buzzing noise pursuing her. She didn't know what direction she'd run, or where she was going. It didn't matter. She had to get out of that shed. That's all that mattered. Susan's skinned body, her missing brain, her skin hanging from the meat hooks like a curtain. The scenes played through Becky's mind, and she had a sudden faint trace of recognition. It was as if she'd already witnessed what she'd found in the shed. The road opened before Becky as she broke from the woods. She stopped in the middle of the road, gasping for breath, glancing up and down the road. It had to be Pine Hollow Road. It just had to be. Towering black trees lined the roads. There was the grey expanse of a nearby field. and shadows were everywhere. Suddenly the buzzing and clicking noise that echoed from the woods stopped. A crackling of twigs underfoot caused Becky to turn. An old man appeared from out of the woods. His hair was white, stringy, his face pale, cheeks sunken. His eyes glistened eerily. He wore a lopsided grin with his head cocked to one side. His clothes were tattered rags. Strangest of all, his skin just seemed to hang on him much like the tattered rags he wore. He cackled as he approached Becky. His gait rocked side to side like an upright, walking chimpanzee. "You're an Akeley, ain't yer?" he cackled, his voice a strangely metallic buzzing. Fear began to rise within her. "What?" she began, as she started to back away from the old man. The old man cackled with glee, then interrupted. "I knowed you was. I can tell by the looks o' yer." Becky turned and dashed into the woods. Behind her she could hear the old man's cackling laughter, his laughter the tone of that strange metallic buzzing he'd spoken with. The pursuing buzzing and clicking noise started again. Becky ran and ran and ran. Aimless. No direction. The woods came alive, clawing at her, taunting her. She gasped, straining, pushing, fighting against fatigue, knowing that it was after her again. Just like before. Another night. Just like before. She remembered the claw on her shoulder. Pinkish. Crab-like. From the woods, Becky burst into the small clearing. She found herself back at the shed where she'd found Susan's body. But Susan was now standing by the side window. The pulsing coloured lights from inside the shed eerily highlighted Susan's face in the soft glow. She grinned, her head cocked to one side. There was something strange about her. She looked thinner, shrunken. Her hair was dishevelled. Her skin seemed to hang on her body. Her eyes were hollow, with dark circles. But it was Susan Lewis, the same Susan Lewis at the library, dressed in a navy blue skirt and matching blazer. For a moment Becky was relieved. Susan hadn't died after all. But then the recent memory of what she'd found in the shed came flooding back. "Susan," she said, puzzled, then pointing at the shed, she added, "I saw you in there. I saw what they did." "I just got here," Susan interrupted. Her voice was mechanical. She smiled. Becky was stunned. She stared wide-eyed at Susan. "What are you talking about? I saw you. They skinned you, cut your brain out. Those cylinders." There was a rattling deep in Susan's throat as she forced the words out. "I just got here, Miss Saunders," she said, her words strangely buzzing like some machine or mechanical insect. "I just got here, got here, got here." Susan buzzed over and over. She raised her hand and started towards Becky. For the first time Becky noticed that, instead of human hands, pink, crab-like claws extended from Susan's shirt-sleeves, the same as in her nightmare. "No!" Becky screamed, as the clicking claws reached for her. She turned, darted across the clearing, and disappeared into the woods. The buzzing noise cut through the woods, shrill, whirling, as if it were excited. Becky could hear the snapping of twigs. It was coming for her, and coming fast. She ran faster, branches clawed her face. She sucked in air. Fear and exertion quickened her breath. The clicking noise was louder. Becky's eyes went wide. It was gaining, nearly upon her. The clicking, the buzzing. Then a light through the trees. Becky broke into a small clearing. There was a small cabin, the cabin of her thoughts, the cabin of her dreams, a soft yellow light glowing within. She hurried across the clearing to the cabin door. A hand on the door handle, she paused as she turned it, then froze. Something had gently touched her right shoulder. Silence descended on the dark woods. The buzzing, the clicking, the snapping of twigs and branches had stopped. Becky caught her breath. Her eyes wide, she turned her head slowly. and resting upon her shoulder she saw a pink claw, like a huge crab. Tears welled in her eyes as she finished the turn and looked at the two figures standing behind her. No, no, no! Her voice was breaking as she shook her head. Standing there were Susan and the old man. Though she had tried to deny it, Becky knew the truth. This wasn't Susan, nor the old man. These were things, horrors that wore their flayed skin. Choking on her fear, all she could say was, "Why?" The thing in Susan's skin spoke, its voice a grating metallic buzzing noise. "Your strange cult's research. You would come to know too much," it said. "I won't. I won't tell anybody," Becky cried. She immediately realized she'd just voiced the standard futile plea for her life that would be ignored. The thing in the old man's skin stepped forward. A third stepped out of the shadows, the third in its horrid, crab-like natural form. "And we need your skin," the old man cackled. It brushed Becky's hand away from the door-handle, opened the door, and pushed it wide. "We got us 'nother Akeley," the thing in the old man's skin added. Their claws closing on her wrists, they led Becky through the door and into the cabin. A soft hum permeated the cabin interior. It was a droning noise Becky knew she'd heard before. The room was gloomy except for the soft glow of red, green, and amber lights. Becky glanced wide at her work table. The papers, notes, articles, theses, and books were scattered on the floor. 3 small metal boxes from the shed rested beneath the table. On the table were the 2 cylinders, both now operational with their 3 lights glowing steadily, one with its top open. Becky's chair had been pushed aside. The chair from the shed now rested against the table, facing the far wall. Becky was led to the chair. The crab-like things turned her, forced her down onto the chair. The thing in Susan's skin bound her wrists and ankles with the straps, and then reached for her head, its claws holding her immobile. What are you going to do to me?" Becky cried. "This won't hurt a bit," the thing wearing Susan's skin buzzed. As the horrid crab-like thing gently rocked back and forth in the shadows, the old man shuffled forward and suddenly held up a strange instrument. It resembled some sort of surgical scalpel. The red, green, and amber lights of the cylinders glinted off its metal. Becky looked up, her eyes wide as the thing leaned towards her. "Now you hold steady, Akeley girl," its buzzing voice cackled. It rested its free claw on top of Becky's head, reached forward with the scalpel, and cut across her forehead in one quick motion. "No!" she screamed, as blood ran down her forehead and into her eyes. She closed her eyes tight, squinting against the flow of blood. In a final frenzied attempt to save herself, she threw herself from the chair, broke through the leather straps as if she'd never been bound, and broke free. Wiping blood from her eyes, she dashed across the room and disappeared into the night through the still open door. Becky ran blindly through the woods. The soft light of the moon cast dancing shadows across her path, while strange shadowy forms danced in fragmented images across her mind. She heard things, strange noises, cackling laughter, buzzing and clicking. She was beyond the point of knowing or caring what was real and what wasn't. To her right, a light twinkled in the dark. It caught her eye. She turned and ran toward it without slowing. It was the moon reflecting off the surface of Pine Hollow Run. At least her jumbled thoughts told her so, and at the creek bank she stumbled and somersaulted into the air. The world spun. Becky crashed into the water. The water was soft, soothing, warm, embracing. Her thoughts began to clear. In a passing moment she realized something seemed out of place. Then it dawned on her. She found herself slowly sinking in Pine Hollow Run, a minor run-off creek hardly more than 4 inches deep. Yet she was immersed in its water. But she didn't care, and brushed the thought away. The warmth of the water caressed and soothed her. She was safe, aloof, content, detached from the cares of the outside world. The soothing darkness closed around her. Her thoughts drifted somewhat, but no longer were they filled with disjointed, frightful images. She heard her own voice again, faint, distant, musical, and metallic. Too late, too late. Dreaming, dreaming in darkness. And in an ever-dwindling moment of curiosity, she reached out with her thoughts through the warm and comforting water, gently touched the curving inner surface of her cylinder, and... Her mind exploded to full, conscious awareness. Her brain was floating in the warm fluid inside the cylinder, and she realised she'd been dreaming events that had taken place days earlier. She screamed a wretched and agonised scream. Her scream was metallic, mechanical, machine-like, as it echoed through the interior of the cabin. As she screamed, the amber light on the face of her cylinder flashed wildly. The mechanical sound of her voice poured forth from the speaker of a machine beneath the work-table. The thing stood in the shadows of the woods just above the bank of Beaver Creek near the iron bridge. Across the creek stood the reconstructed Lock No. 36, on the grounds of Beaver Creek State Park. A family of 4, parents and 2 children, walked along the lock's north wall, oblivious to the thing across the creek. The thing made a soft clicking and buzzing noise as it watched the family. For a moment it thought it had been seen. The adult male walking along the lock had paused and glanced in the direction where the thing stood. The thing pulled deeper into the shadows and watched. Presently the adult male turned away. Clicking softly to itself, the thing turned and shuffled away, swaying unevenly on its clawed feet. It buzzed a soft chuckle, realising it had nothing to fear from those at the lock. After all, they couldn't see clearly from the distance which had separated them. To them at the lock, the thing would have appeared as just another human, a young woman. The thing buzzed another soft chuckle as it continued deeper into the woods. And the disguise it wore, it was a good disguise. The clothes, skin, face and hair of Becky Sanders.